For as long as human beings have existed on this planet, we have always worshipped powers greater than ourselves. For thousands of years, people believed that there were many gods, and they used to tell one another stories about them. By studying those stories, we can learn a lot about how our ancient ancestors lived and what kinds of things they believed about good, evil, and how to best live our lives. For example, in the ancient world, people believed that there were many different gods, and they didn't think that all of them were good. People used to teach their children that this world was often a bad place because evil gods had populated it with wicked people. Not surprisingly, the children often grew up believing that the good people were those of their own tribe, but the people of other tribes, other nationalities, and other races were far more likely to be evil, and so they were taught to avoid those people because they looked different and worshipped different gods. This kind of tribal religion led to a lot of suffering, conflict. There were even wars fought over questions about which gods were good or evil or more powerful, until a group of people called the Hebrews began to teach people that this idea of there being many gods was just plain wrong. There's only one God. The Hebrew religion taught that he is good and that he loves us, all of us. They taught their children that this God made us to be good, to be like him, and to love one another just as he loves us. The Hebrews taught that God had made the world to be good. They were perfectly willing to admit that evil did exist, but it didn't come from God or from some kind of devil. No, the Hebrews taught that if there was evil in the world, it was because it originated with us. Because although God made us to be good, he also gave us the ability to choose between good and evil. Unlike animals, we can decide to do what's right, or we can do things that are cruel, unjust, or just plain wrong. And the stories that the Hebrews told about making these kinds of choices and about how that impacted their relationship with God almost always seem to make the same point, that when we choose to do bad things, there are inevitably consequences. Now, many of these stories were collected in a book that we now call the Bible. Some people have tried to interpret the Bible as if it were a science book or a history lesson, but that's not really what it is. Every story in the Bible has a moral or ethical lesson to teach us. And if you read the stories carefully, you'll begin to see how humanity slowly groped its way from these old primitive ideas about good and evil gods towards a more enlightened understanding of how we should be living our lives. The stories that make up the first half of the Bible are among the most profound pieces of literature that have ever been produced. Tales such as those of Adam and Eve, Noah, and Moses each have lessons to teach us. But it's when you put all of these stories together that they add up to something that's truly staggering. The story of mankind's gradual transformation from a collection of tribes that only seemed to know how to fight with each other to the birth of a single tribe, a single race, the human race, united in the worship of one God. Now, the ideas that were put forth in the first half of the Bible, the part that we now call the Old Testament, were developed and perfected in the second half of the book, the part that we call the New Testament. The New Testament is about the life and teachings of one man, the most important and influential person in all of human history, Jesus of Nazareth. The New Testament is made up of 27 books, and the most important ones are the 4 that are called the Gospels. These 4 books tell us that Jesus was not only a man, a fully human person, just like the rest of us, but he was also a fully divine being, the only Son of the one God, whom God sent to us to show us just how much he loved us and how we should live, by trying to be as much like him as we can. Now, the things that Jesus taught are all rooted in the ideas of the Old Testament, but they go much, much further. For example, the Old Testament taught that living a good life meant following God's laws. But the Old Testament's ideas of God's laws were certainly not limited to the 10 Commandments. The book contains literally hundreds of such laws: how to eat, how to dress, how to pray, when to work, when to sleep, who to marry, and so forth. The Old Testament taught that if you meticulously observed all of these laws, then God would reward you with riches and power. But if you failed to observe any of them, even one of them, you could be cursed with poverty, sickness, and death. So, how do the teachings of Jesus differ from those of the Old Testament? Well, his main idea was simply this: in order to live a good life, there was really only one law to worry about: love God and love your neighbor. Do that, and all the rest would take care of itself. This very simple idea is the essence of Christianity, and it is really the only thing that Jesus asks of us. And yet the implications of this very simple commandment demand that we live our lives not in pursuit of wealth or power for ourselves, but in service to others, especially the poor, the downtrodden, the sick, and the helpless. Now, inevitably, Jesus' teachings about loving everybody, even our enemies, brought him into direct conflict with the richest and most powerful people of his time. And so, they had him arrested and executed on a cross. It was a cruel, bitter, and unjust death. But Jesus' story did not end with his crucifixion. Just 3 days after he was murdered, he rose from the dead and continued preaching his message of love through the 12 men that had been with him during his public life. And so, with guidance from the resurrected Jesus, faith in God the Father, and courage from God the Holy Spirit, the disciples of Jesus, working through the Holy Trinity, established an institution that is still with us today. This institution is called the Catholic Church. The seeds of this new church were sown shortly after Jesus' resurrection, when the apostles scattered throughout the Roman Empire, forming new communities of Christian believers wherever they went. With the aid of the Holy Spirit, the church began to grow in size, numbers, and geography. Many new people who had never met Jesus themselves were able to come to believe in and accept his message. They became Christians and then spread the good news to others. But before many centuries had passed, that one holy and apostolic church had to face much opposition, persecution, and even internal battles. For many historical, theological, and political reasons, by the middle of the 16th century, that one church had begun to splinter into many different denominations of Christianity. That is why today the community of believers in Jesus Christ is not exclusively Catholic. It includes many other groups as well: Lutherans, Anglicans, and Baptists, just to name a few. Catholicism is the oldest and largest Christian religion in the world. It teaches that Jesus' simple commandment of love is the key that makes it possible for us to live lives that are fully human, filled with joy and happiness, and rewarded not with earthly riches or power, but with eternal riches and spiritual glory. For this reason, the Church is dedicated to Jesus' mission of service to the poor, the sick, and the powerless, and through programs like this one, it continues to educate people like yourself about the life and teachings of this, the greatest person who ever lived, the man called Jesus Christ, the Anointed One, the Son of God.